Ladies and gentlemen, Congressman Pfluger.
Well, good afternoon. This is Congressman August Pfluger, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to offer an introduction to our special guest and join you virtually today for the 2023 State of Oil and Gas. I wish I could be there with you in person, but I'm currently in D.C. due to changes to our congressional schedule. I'd like to personally thank Bobby Burns, the CEO of the Midland Chamber of Commerce, for inviting me to offer the introduction today. But to all of you in the room, representing the hard-working men and women of the Permian Basin, the most prolific oil and gas producing region in the world, it's an incredible honor to be with you. It's been a historic start to our new Republican majority in Congress, and I'm excited to share some good news with you that I've been selected to serve on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. This means for the first time in history that the Permian Basin, Midland, and Odessa will have a voice and a seat at the table, an advocate on the very committee tasked with securing our nation's energy supply. I will be working to further the interests of the Permian Basin and support the critical role our region plays in balancing global oil and gas markets and in securing our own national security. In addition to the critical energy responsibilities, this committee will be a part of the solution for every major issue currently facing our nation. This includes holding big tech accountable and ensuring our rural communities have the quality health care they deserve. I am committed to leveraging my position on this committee to lower costs for American families, to fight for free speech, and to preserve our free market. Last Congress, permitting reform quickly became the center of the energy policy discussion, and for good reason. The Biden administration threatened the Permian Basin with a non-attainment redesignation zone for ozone, which would have drastically hampered production in our region. I proudly joined with State Representative Brooks Landgraf, Speaker Tom Craddock, and Governor Abbott in pushing against this redesignation. It appears that the Biden administration has backed down for now, as it was not listed on their unified agenda for 2023. This is an important victory. It's a tactical victory, but it shows that the administration is watching what Congress does. The work's not over, and I'm going to continue to push back against threats like this and work with my colleagues, including Representative Landgraf and Speaker Craddock, to make sure that our nation's energy security is actually secure. I will continue working to focus the permitting conversation to address issues with categorical exclusions and federal lease sales, expedite LNG exports, and end the regulatory uncertainty projects face with changing administrations, and do everything we can to block endangered species listings that have been weaponized in the past few years. If this administration is serious about supplying our allies with energy, while simultaneously lowering prices for American consumers, the president must take permitting reform seriously. We must also not ignore opportunities to reform the litigation process, a real source of delays and large cost increase for our producers. Litigation reform would reduce the environmental damage caused by the suppression of new capital investment to replace older facilities. It would put an end to the completeness requirement for agency reviews before permits are granted, a source of endless litigation and delay, focusing on the major environmental impacts rather than hundreds of minor ones that can be predicted to cancel out. In essence, we need to make the United States more like Texas, in fact, more like the Permian Basin when it comes to pipelines and infrastructure and production. The producers in this room today are a major part of the solution, and I'd like to thank you for being part of that solution. It's now my honor to introduce our special guest today, Mr. Richard Dealy, the President and Chief Operating Officer of Pioneer Resources, who will be our keynote speaker today. Richard has served as the President and COO of Pioneer since his appointment in January of 2021. But his history, his work, and his legacy at Pioneer span over 30 years. Prior to his current role, Richard served in various capacities at Pioneer as Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer from November 2004 through December of 2020, as Vice President and Chief Accounting Officer prior to that from 1998 to 2004, and Vice President and Controller from 1997 to 1998. Richard joined Parker & Parsley, a predecessor to this company, in July of 1992 and was promoted to Vice President and Controller in 1996, a position that he served in until August of 1997. He's a certified public accountant, and before joining Parker & Parsley, he was employed by KPMG. You know, Richard is similar to many people in this industry. He not only brings a lifetime of experience, but he also brings a passion and a patriotism for our country. I've spoken with Richard, and I stay in contact with Pioneer, and we're so proud of the work that they do in the Permian Basin to secure our energy future, to secure our energy security, and to make sure that every American household has affordable and reliable energy. I hope that you will join me in offering a very warm welcome today to our special guest, the guest of honor, Mr. Richard Dealy.
Well, thanks, Congressman. It's a pleasure to be here. I always enjoy coming back to Midland. And while he talked about that long span, all that really means is I'm old now. And so, really, my professional career started here in Midland. So I moved out to Midland in 1989, straight from college in eastern New Mexico, with everything I owned in the car, and came to work for KPMG. And my second client happened to be this little oil and gas company called Parker & Parsley. It was probably a $200 million company at that point in time, so big from my standpoint, but not from where we are today in terms of a $60 billion company. But worked a tremendous amount there, a lot of fond memories here. I met my wife here of 30 years. Both our kids were born here at Midland Memorial, and I remember the day in 1997 when I came home to tell my wife, actually told, but no, actually I'd probably say, I suggested to her that it would be the best part of my career to see if we wouldn't go ahead and move to Dallas and with Pioneer, when we changed the name from Parker & Parsley to Pioneer with the combination with Mesa. So needless to say, it was a great career for me. I've enjoyed every minute of it. It's the people that really make the difference. And really Midland, when I look back and thought about it this weekend, and I think about all of our closest friends between Jennifer and I, my wife, and all those friends, we met them right here in that 10 years that we lived in Midland. The ones that we keep in contact day in and day out were met here in Midland. And so it's really just, I don't know what it is about the water or special sauce, whatever it is, once you meet somebody from Midland, they're lifelong friends. And, it's amazing where you'll just run into people from Midland. I've run into people from Midland all over the place. A couple months ago, we were at the Garth Brooks concert, and I'm sitting down next to this gentleman, and we strike up a conversation, and lo and behold, he's the principal of an elementary school here that's here at Garth Brooks. A month or two later, I'm out at Cooper's Clinic getting my company physical, and Dave Sutter is sitting across the room. I was like, okay, well, Dave and I have worked together forever. So, it's just you run into people from Midland, and it's just great to be back here and be able to participate in this event. So a couple thanks, really, like Bobby said, thanks to Lori for being here, for Stephanie being here, and a lot of the other elected officials that are here, or community leaders. We really appreciate you all being here for this, and look forward to that opportunity to share a little bit of what we see on the macro and for the Permian Basin going forward. And then a special thanks to Bobby and the Midland Chamber of Commerce for all that they're doing to support the community, business development across the city and the county and the Permian Basin at large. And so really, hats off to all the work that's being done, and glad Pioneer can be a small part of that, along with a lot of the other companies that are here today. So with that, what I thought I would do is, really start out with a couple macro slides about how we see the long-term view of oil and gas prices, and then talk some about the Permian, and then some of the opportunities or challenges that we may face to hit those trajectories that I think that we're going to see. Start here, read that really fast. It's forward-looking statements. So really, executive summary to kind of kick it off in terms of the topics I want to talk about is really that oil demand is continuing to increase. I think when you look around the world of what is happening, and particularly when you think about China and the lockdowns that have gone on there, and them coming out of those lockdowns, we anticipate a significant amount of demand increase over the course of the next really 3 or 4 years, but 2023 specifically, as China lockdowns come to an end. We've seen projections, when you add not only what's happening in China, but what's happening around the world in terms of just global growth and GDP growth, that I've seen estimates anywhere from 1.5 million barrels a day demand growth all the way up to 3 million barrels of demand growth. And I would submit to you that if we see that type of growth in world demand, that we're not going to have the supply to meet it, mainly because supply and I'll show you some slides on this, is limited. You only have really Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, UAE that have extra supply. Iran probably has extra supply, but given their ties with Russia and what's going on there, I don't see any sanctions getting lifted on Iran anytime soon. So I think that we're just short supply, and I think then you add on top of that what's happening with Russia, and we've heard anywhere between 500,000 barrels a day of Russia supply coming off the market to over 1.5 million barrels a day of Russian supply coming off the market over time. It probably is going to happen gradually. It's not going to happen all at once, but I do anticipate that you will see supply reduction, and particularly without Western technology coming out of Russia. And so when you kind of put those two things together, what's going to cause us not to be in a place where you have higher prices? Potentially, that's really what the market is experiencing today in terms of concerns about a recession. And so I think a recession is possible. Europe's probably in a recession today. So the thought is, are we still going to have a recession in the U.S., and will it be a soft landing, hard landing? How much does that have in terms of implications to oil demand going forward? And I'll talk about that. I would tell you that based on history, it would seem to be fairly minimal. And so if you have a minimal recession, I just don't think that's going to change the trajectory of being short on supply if you get some demand growth. So where does that leave us in terms of what do we think about oil and gas prices? We would think that oil and gas prices for the next 3 to 5 years are probably going to be in that $80 to $120 range. This based on where we see supply not being able to keep pace with demand. And the Permian Basin is going to play a big factor in that. The Permian Basin is the only basin in the U.S. that is still showing material growth. It has slowed from what we saw in 2015-2020 period, where we were growing, roughly, 800 to 1 million barrels a day out of the Permian Basin. This year we would anticipate that being around 500, 600,000 barrels a day of growth, and I would expect that to slow just over time, just because of supply chain constraints, takeaway capacity, a number of other things. But it's still going to be the only basin in the U.S. that is continuing to grow, and we would anticipate that to be somewhere around 300 to 400,000 barrels a day of growth for the next few years, and then probably slowing to 200 to 300,000 barrels a day of growth, and we see it growing all the way into the 2030 time period. These next charts I'm going to show you are really just illustrative of kind of the points I made on the executive summary, and I just think they're interesting ones for everybody to kind of look at and ponder, and I think they support why we're going to continue to see increasing demand and why supply issues are going to be a potential problem, which just bodes well for higher commodity prices. If you look here at consistent oil demand, this dark line here is where actual oil demand sits, and the red line is the trend line, if you will, across that. And you can see that when you get up to 2022, we're off the trend line, and that's predominantly because of Chinese demand being down. I think if you see Chinese demand come back up, that you're going to move back to that trend line, and which means we're going to be over 100 million barrels a day of oil demand out there in the world, and growing to 105 or more. If you look at the not just the trend, but then say, what do other think tanks do? We subscribe to a number of think tanks, inside the company, and really try and monitor where do we see oil demand going. And so you can see here, that shaded bars, there's a wide range of people's forecasts out there. But generally, if you look at between now and 2030, they're all up. It's just to what magnitude are they up? And the flatter those lines are really because of people building in transition to EV, electric vehicles, and it's taking away from gasoline demand, diesel demand, anything that's transportation, because it really comes down, most of these forecasts are based on what is the transportation demand going to be. I would tell you that I'm a bit pessimistic on the adoption of EVs, mainly because, as you all know, rare earth minerals are hard to come by. They're in places, most of those are in China, South America, other places, and the cost of those have gone up huge amounts of growth in what those costs have been. And so when you look at the average price of an EV vehicle today in the U.S., it's around $66,000 is what I read last week. If you think about a combustion engine, its price is in the mid-30s. And so I just think from a pure affordability for the middle-class American, it's going to be harder and harder for them to buy EV vehicles, because I just think those are going to continue to go up over time as rare earth minerals are hard. I actually serve on another company's board that's trying to develop lithium, and it's a massive undertaking. The technology is still there, and so it just seems like it's going to be a huge lift to get the amount of materials that we need to have EVs be a significant portion of it. If it works, great, because I think we're going to be, for all the demand stuff we're going to need, that it's something that we're definitely going to need, all sources of power, whether it's wind, solar, nuclear, or hydrogen, oil and gas. All those things are going to be necessary, and so, more power to them if we can actually get there. I just think it's going to be a heavier lift than people are anticipating. So one of the things that really drives oil demand is population growth. So this chart is United Nations and their projection of population growth between now and 2050. That's another 1.5 billion people, or 20% increase in the population around the world. Well, as we all know, as population grows, they have energy needs and energy demands. And so I just think that the sheer magnitude of the population growth is going to cause demand for energy to increase and be at the higher end of that range that I showed you on the prior slide, just because of the population growth. This next slide is really, even if you have the EV transition take place and electric vehicles have a bigger consumption and adoption in the world, and so oil demand for transportation fuels goes down, the increase in petrochemical demand is supposed to be pretty significant. So you can see here, petrochemical is kind of everyday things that we use, from plastics to furniture to clothing to you name it, medicines. Petrochemicals are in all those things, and most of this petrochemical growth is coming from places where that population growth was on the other slide, which is Asia and Africa. But the demand out there, people are going to want, if we have that population growth, they're going to want gadgets, they're going to want iPads, iPhones, you name it, they're going to have those things that are going to be needed. And so the demand for petrochemical, I would submit, is going to continue to grow. So you're talking here, 20 million barrels a day of demand just from petrochemicals over that time period. So what are the things that could derail that? And I talked about a recession. And so I thought this slide was interesting, just as if you think about over the last 50 years, what has been the increase annually or decrease for oil demand. And so those green bars and the red bars represent annual growth or deceleration of oil demand. And then we layered over the top of that in those longer gray bars the periods that we've had recessions. And so if you look at the red bars during those gray bars, that when we had recessions, on average a recession is basically a little over 1 million barrels a day of demand destruction from a recession. So even if we have a recession and it's 1 million barrels, it's 1 million barrels out of 100 million barrels of demand. And ironically, not that these are linked, but from a supply standpoint, that's the amount of barrels we just stopped by not releasing barrels out of the SPR, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, at the end of last year. So, I just don't see, even in a semi-bad recession, it really, hurting demand enough that supply is going to be able to keep pace. So when you look at supply and move towards supply, it's really a case of why is that supply not going to be able to keep up with demand? And I'd probably show you a couple things here on these slides. The first is global inventories. Global inventories for oil and products generally are at all-time lows. Products are a little better off than oil. And then when you look at spare capacity in the world, our spare capacity is very, very low. And so if we have any demand increases, you're just not going to see supply be able to hit that. If you guys have noticed, I'm sure you guys watch it, there's just not a lot of new discoveries of oil around the world. Your biggest ones are probably in Guyana and Namibia being the other one. And so I just think that supply is not coming. And I'll show you a couple of slides of reasons why here. But like I said, Saudi Arabia and UAE are really the only two countries out there that have any spare capacity to speak of. So why are we in this supply situation? And I would say, if you look at this slide, this is the exploration and production capital spending, since 2012 through 2022. And if you look at that chart there, and I went back to actually 2010, the time period between 2010 and 2015, compared to the time period between 2016 and 2022, the industry, collectively has invested $1 trillion less in adding new supply. So $1 trillion of less investment is why we're in this supply situation. Because as you guys know, historically, if there was a demand increase, supply was always there to meet it. I don't think this time around that supply is going to be there for things like this, of just the lack of investment. And why is this lack of investment happening? It's really a multitude of things. It can be inflation, supply chain, more recently. But I think a lot of it goes back to, one, the shale revolution. And so shale was adding all these reserves, and people said it was now the swing producer. And so people slowed down because shale had made such a prolific growth. Permian Basin, case in point, up from 1 million barrels a day to 5.5 million barrels today. So dramatic increases. And then I think just the discussions in social media, politics about the demise of fossil fuels, and that the investors for the first time were talking about having the terminal value of oil and gas companies. I can remember 2 years ago sitting on an investor call with the European investors and asking them why they weren't investing in Pioneer, and the response was, I don't think you're going to be around when we get to 2030. And I was like, okay, I kind of took you aback and said, really? Yeah, 2030, that's just around the corner here. So I think all that has changed with the war in Ukraine and people talking about energy transition and now energy security being much more at the forefront. And so I think that has shifted, but I think that was one of the reasons why everybody said, if that's where people think, then why would I invest a bunch of capital today? The other slide here that I think was telling is really the discussions that we've had with our investors, and really changing the E&P model for public companies, at least in terms of how much capital we're reinvesting into the market. And so you can see here, as you all know, we generally, as a public company, prior to 2020, were growing as fast as we could, 15, 20% growth. We were reinvesting 100% plus of our cash flow back into drilling and adding new supply. What we didn't really talk about is, and what investors were, as we saw investors keep moving out of our industry and going and investing in tech stocks or other S&P 500 sectors, is that we weren't making a return that was adequate that competed with these other sectors. If you look at the period between 2020 and going back 10 years to 2010 or so, the return on capital employed, which is a standard metric that the financial market will look at, the E&P sector in total was a return on capital employed of 2%. I just didn't compete. It didn't compete with other S&P energy sections. And so from discussions with shareholders, they said, if you want to be competitive, we need to get a competitive return. And so how do we get that competitive return? Well, one, we need more stable oil and gas prices. So if we slow growth, shale growth down some, you're going to have a steadier price. It hasn't quite worked out the way for all these other reasons, but that was the theory behind it. And then if you can also return more capital to shareholders in terms of dividends and share repurchases, and be much more capital disciplined. And so under this model, I would say that when we look at the forecast, most companies for 2022, I think will be in that 25 to 30% return on capital employed. I think longer term, over a more moderate commodity price, and with what's happening with inflation, we can anticipate being in that 15 to 25% return on capital employed standpoint. And that's what's really attracting investors back into the business. We saw that in 2022. Energy sector was the best performing sector in the S&P 500. The energy sector, you heard Mike Wirth talk about it on CNBC this morning, is generating over 10% of the earnings in the S&P 500, but yet we only represent 5% of the market within the S&P 500. And so those are the things that I think that are drawing people back into it. We all trade at relatively low multiples compared to, when I say multiples, that means multiples of our cash flows where our stocks trade relative to the other S&P 500. So I think there's lots of running room left in the energy sector. But it's really just getting that consistent return on capital employed that the market is looking for will continue to attract investors back into energy stocks, and be there longer term to reward those companies for their efforts. So, suffice it to say, I think we have a compelling future in terms of what oil and gas is going to do. We've got low supplies, lack of investment that's happened, and so what's that translate into? It's translating into higher commodity prices. And so while the futures curve doesn't really show, if you look at WTI and what the future says out the next 4 or 5 years, 7 years, it doesn't really reflect where we think prices are going to be in that $80 to $120 range. And I think the reason that you don't see that, even though we all kind of build our capital budgets, we look at what we're going to spend the next year based on what we think futures prices are going to be, and we all look at the curve. I would submit that it's not a very good predictor of future oil prices. And really, I found this next slide interesting that we saw over Christmas time. We just happened to see it. And so it takes a little bit because it's kind of a busy chart. Looks like one of my kids, did it with crayons or something. But if you take each one of those years, this is the last 25 years, and on January 1, those green lines are what the forward futures curve said oil and gas prices were going to be for the next couple of years. and so you can see during periods of time, and then the blue line is actual prices, how they actually played out. So you can see on that chart that the green lines are typically in a lot of white space. So it means that actual oil and gas prices didn't turn out exactly how the forward curve thought it was going to. And if you kind of roll it to the tape to the end of that chart, you can see where the futures curve sits today, that green line, versus where oil and gas prices are. and I think these next slides really kind of put it in perspective what, not just Pioneer thinks, but what is, other think tanks out there, people that are projecting oil and gas prices, where do they see prices? I could have added, 10 more, onto this chart, but on the oil side, I tried to bracket it in terms of the range, and so you see S&P 500 here, probably at the lower end, it's near around the 80, but then you can see, Goldman, much more closer to that 110, so within that range. And I think, all these forecasters are really out there basically saying that for all the supply and demand fundamentals that I've talked about, we're going to have higher prices. We just don't have the supply to meet with the demand. And, it's anybody's guess of what that will be. What I would submit to you is, though, that, there's always these external factors that you can't predict. So when someone says, well, Rich, what's the exact oil price going to be? I'm not going to sit here and give you an exact oil price. What I will tell you is that I think the probability of it, being 100 is higher than it being 60. And so, I just think it's going to be a bigger probability that we're going to be in a higher environment for a longer period of time than we're going to go back to the 50 or 60 range that we've seen in years past, given the shortness of supply and lack of investment, going into new supply out there. On the gas side, we're generally in that $3.50 to $4.50 range. I would say that, this chart is dated. We've seen gas prices we had the winter storm, Elliott, I think they called it, over Christmas, that cold patch across the U.S. kind of propped up gas prices. We had higher gas prices last year because of just moving as much LNG as we could to Europe to help them out. But now that we've had, basically since that storm, warmer weather, gas prices are probably down 20% from this time when we put this chart together. And, it would bode when you look at the longer term forecast that it looks like we're going to have a warmer weather. It's probably, a blessing for Europe in the sense that they're not going to deplete the gas that they were, and people weren't going to have their lights off and not be able to heat there. But it means that we're probably going to have lower natural gas prices. And in fact, I, probably unrelated, but heard that we actually went negative Waha prices over the weekend out here again from a pipeline interruption. So, gas prices I think are just going to be weak. Longer term, I do think that gas prices are going to move back up. I think as more LNG facilities on the Gulf Coast get built, more of the gas, particularly the Permian, will move to the Gulf Coast and be exported to Europe and Asia. One interesting stat of all the LNG that was imported around the world last year with what happened in Russia, 25% of all LNG cargoes ended up in Europe last year, which is surprising to me because, they were moving away from, natural gas or had it from Russia. They didn't have very many LNG import facilities. Well, they've been building them at record pace. In fact, Germany's getting their third regasification facility this week, and they've done that all in less than a year's time period. So just a massive amount of effort and work being done to put Europe in a position where they're not dependent on Russian gas going forward. So what I thought I'd do is switch here now really and talk more about the Permian Basin particularly. And you can see here of all the basins in the U.S. or the major basins, where has production growth gone and come from. And you can see, as I mentioned earlier, back in 2014 time period, the Permian Basin was producing about 1 million barrels a day. It is mind-boggling to me and astronomical how fast it was able to move to 5.5 million barrels a day coming out of the Permian Basin. Obviously, horizontal drilling made a tremendous difference, but what this did for the U.S. and what it did for our allies is incredible. And it's all on the backs of the work of people in this room and across the Permian Basin. To get this type of growth has really made the U.S. energy independent that we just weren't before. We were still importing, tremendous amounts of oil, and the work that was done out of the Permian Basin, has put the U.S. in a great place politically, not only to be self-sufficient, but also to help our allies with oil. We Pioneer, we move about 325 to 350,000 barrels a day to the Gulf Coast. 40 to 70%, it varies by month, gets exported, and basically 50% of that ends up going to Asia, and 50% of that's been going to Europe. As of recently, most of it's been going to Europe to help them with their situation over there. And we're just a small, cog of the whole thing in terms of the global markets. But the Permian, when I first started out here, it was vertical wells. If we sold it the lease, we were happy it was kind of done and moved on. It is a global world now that we're all dealing with, and it's just fascinating that we're we probably have 25, 30 different customers that we sell, and put that oil on ships and export it outside the country, because refiners here are still using heavy oil from Canada. We still import some oil, and this light sweet crude is going around the world for mainly transportation and fuel use. So what does that mean going forward? Where do we see that Permian growth going? And so I've got a few slides in here on, these are Pioneer's forecasts of where we see production coming out of the Permian Basin. And we see it, over the rest of this decade of moving, closer to about 7 million barrels a day. So up about another 1.5 million barrels from where we sit today. To accomplish that, we see the rig count continue to increase. I'll show you a rig slide here in a minute that, we're kind of in that 330 or so rigs running in the basin today. We think that's, gradually going to move up, closer to 400 rigs over the course of this decade. But we're going to be at 7 million barrels a day is how we see it. And then we think once we get there, just given the depth of inventory that's out here, that it's going to be there for a long period of time. So a lot of growth yet to come out of the Permian Basin that will really be used for continue to be exported, used domestically, but also support our allies. So one of the frequent questions we get is, well, what does that mean about takeaway capacity? And fortunately, with all the pipelines that were built in that 2015 to 2020 period, we have plenty of capacity to move that oil away from the Permian Basin. Some of it still goes up to Cushing, but the vast majority is now moving to the Gulf Coast. It's either going into U.S. refineries or being put on ships and being exported around the world. So fortunately, in a very good situation that as we accomplish this growth, I'm sure there'll be some maintenance and infrastructure done, but for the most part, we're in good shape from a capacity to move that oil to markets that need the volumes. On gas, we see, just like on oil, we continue to see it to grow and grow from about 15 to 16 BCF a day. This is dry gas. So I'll talk a minute about wet gas, including the NGLs. But on a dry gas basis, we see that going from 15 to 16 BCF a day to 22 to 23 BCF a day by the 2030 time period, and then continue to grow. With the gas-oil ratio that comes out of the basin, we anticipate gas, even when oil's flat, will continue to creep up. So a lot of gas coming out here. It's all got to go to the Gulf Coast for the most part. It's going to go into incremental LNG facilities. We see LNG facilities, and I'm sure you do, assuming they get permitted from the government, we're basically 12 BCF a day today of exports on the Gulf Coast of LNG. We see that growing to 20 to 25 BCF a day by the end of this decade. And the U.S. will be probably the first or second largest exporter of LNG, Qatar being the other country that has a big supply of LNG hitting the market. So, really this Permian gas is because of the longevity of it and how long it's going to produce. It's really going to be the feedstock for these LNG facilities. A lot of people talk about the Haynesville being another big gas play that will be feedstock, and it will be feedstock, but the studies that we've seen on the Haynesville is that its inventory is going to dry up a lot faster, and production probably peaks in the second half of this decade and then rolls over pretty strong. And so when you're signing 15-year, 20-year contracts for LNG, you want to know the gas is going to be there. The Permian is where that gas is going to come from. Haynesville gas will roll over. So what does that mean for takeaway capacity? And this is the area where more infrastructure is definitely going to be needed, not only from gas plants, but also on pipelines. You can see here that we're basically at the capacity, and many of you know this just by what's happening in the basin, at capacity on takeaway for gas out of the basin. So we're producing that 15, 16 BCF. Anytime there's a hiccup on pipeline maintenance, we see gas go negative. If you look at differentials out here for Waha and gas, which is Permian Basin Index, it's probably $1.50, $1.60 off of NYMEX prices. That's just we've got more gas than we've got capacity to move that gas to markets that need it. And so, we're going to need, basically another 2 BCF a day pipeline every, 18 to 24 months, in our opinion, to move this gas to the Gulf Coast, to these LNG facilities. And they're in the works. I mean, if you look out there and we've got basically some compression coming on the second half of this year. You got Matterhorn pipeline coming on in the second half of 2024. And then you've got 3 or 4 other pipelines that are actually being proposed by multiple different companies to move gas to various places along the Gulf Coast that, Pioneer is definitely looking at. We will take capacity on, 1 or more of those pipelines. And I suspect that they all get built, but they're going to need to get built in order to handle this takeaway capacity as this growth that's coming at us over the next 7 or 8 years. I talked about rig count a second ago, so you can see about 330 rigs. It's been flat really for the last 6 or 7 months, and so the question is, why has it been flat? And I would say that it's mainly been flat because of, one, oil prices, falling, and so people are cautious about adding new rigs when you're falling, but then just the tightness of supply chain and just getting, whether it's equipment, people, pipe, you name it, supply chain has been tight, and then just the inflationary pressure that we've all been facing. I mean, we've probably seen 20% plus inflation in 2022. We're forecasting something in that, another 10% plus or so inflation in 2023. Fortunately, the rate of change has slowed, and so I think it's the tide is starting to turn. But we still got, we're still going to have inflation in 2023 on top of what we experienced in 22. But like I said, I do anticipate that this rig count moves closer to 400 rigs over time. So a couple things that, I think are interesting and opportunities, concerns that in order to accomplish this growth is power. Electric power out here, all energy companies, Pioneer included, is looking at how do we move more of our operations to electric drilling, electric frac fleets, electric compression, and what does that mean from the demand that we're going to have for power? And when you look at it out there, and I'm just talking about Pioneer, and there's a lot of smarter people on it than me, and a lot of our staff working with ERCOT and Encore and others on this, is what does that mean from a power demand? And when we just look at Pioneer, I would anticipate it's at least a doubling, if not a tripling, of our power demand if we were to move over the next 2 or 3 years to 100% electricity for drilling, completions, and compression. You multiply that by all the other producers in the basin, and that's a dramatic increase in power demand. And today the infrastructure doesn't exist, and the supply of power doesn't exist. So, I think it's just something that we all have got to work together. It just may mean that the transition to highline power or grid power takes longer. And once again, we're going to need it, whether it's solar, wind, but I would say those, to me, aren't reliable enough. As I just shown, we've got an abundance of gas out here. We're going to need more gas-powered electric generation coming out of the basin over time, and it's something that we need to start thinking about today. And reason why, say, well, why go to all electric? And to me, it's one of those things that's it's good business. When we look at the cost of us moving to electric compression, frac fleets, drilling, over time is the cost, is better than diesel or CNG today. Now, time will tell if that changes, and we also think it's good from an environmental standpoint. So to me, it's what I'll call good business, and since it's cheaper, more efficient, and less emissions, so it's good for the environment, and it's a win-win situation. Another challenge out there and concern or opportunity is really related to workforce. I mean, I think you all are experiencing, and we see it, in help wanted signs all over, businesses around the U.S., but in Texas as well, on, labor force. So, this is a projection by the Perriman Group. It's just not tied exactly to Pioneer's forecast of oil growth and gas growth, but I do think it's a good indication of what's going to be necessary from a growth standpoint of labor force. And what I found interesting is, because we don't really think about it often, is you can see the green. That's the addition of what we need for additional workforce to accomplish that growth. But what we tend to forget about is the red, which is retirees and replacement. So not only do you have to have new, but you got to, those that are leaving the workforce for good reasons, and that they're retiring, and hopefully they have a great retirement. But we're going to need people to replace that too. And so I just think it's something that we've got to work on, and it really starts here at home. We've got to, the best way to get that labor force is to develop our own leaders here in West Texas, develop that next generation, get that talent here. And so as part of that, it's really incumbent on all of us, coming alongside MISD, Ector ISD, and really, how do we educate that next group of leaders that really will, fill this room in meetings in the future about that. And so it's, all of us need to look at that and figure out how do we participate and come alongside, the superintendent and others to make sure that it's a successful and draws people. The other thing is healthcare. If we want to attract people out here, having great education, having great healthcare is going to be, extremely important to attracting new talent in new areas. I'm sure there's other things, housing and other things that have to take place, but two that are really first and foremost is education and healthcare. We think are going to be extremely important to the next generation of people and talent that we're going to need to make this great industry even better. So, how do we do that? Well, part of it is really, working with the state of Texas. I would say the Permian Basin, and you all are punching way above your weight in the sense that there's 1.6% of the population out here in West Texas that's, driving this growth, but we're providing 8% of the GDP to the state of Texas. So really punching above our weight in terms of what we bring to the state. And that's $12 billion of total taxes to the state of Texas. So it's really continuing to partner with the state and say, how do we have some of that money get reinvested back in, whether it's schools, whether it's healthcare, whether it's roads, all these things, to really have some of that money come back and be reinvested to continue to allow the Permian Basin to grow and meet those growth objectives. Another way to do that is really, working where businesses come together and work with the communities across the Permian Basin. And I think Permian Strategic Partnership has been a great way for member companies in the business community to come together, pool money, and then under Don Evans and Tracy Bentley's leadership, really work with the communities and how do we leverage that money into things that make good business sense and help the communities across the basin. And so the member companies of Permian Partnership have raised $125 million. You can see where that's been deployed across it, but they've really leveraged it into almost $1 billion. And to me, this is a good example of other things that we all need to come together to support, because it's making a difference across the basin. So, hats off to all those companies and the work that Tracy and their teams are doing. So as I, kind of wrap up here, just a couple things on Pioneer. One, we've got 1,000 employees out here, and I'm sure many other companies in the room that do a tremendous amount for the community too. I get to see this firsthand of what people in this room are doing, and so this is just a few of the things that we've been able to participate with the City of Midland on, and that we're extremely proud of and happy to participate in giving back to the community. So hats off to our employees for what they do, and hats off to the rest of you and your employees out there for what they do for the community as well. And then maybe as Bobby makes his way up here for a few questions, I'll end here on really the 25 years of Pioneer. Pioneer, became Pioneer in 1997. We celebrated our 25th anniversary last year. And it all started in the Permian Basin. And then some may say we lost our way. Some may say we were looking because it was vertical and we thought we were the biggest stripper field in the U.S. is how they referred to the Permian versus now what I would say is the second largest or third largest oil field in the world. And so it's come a long ways. But as we've gone from being 100% Permian, and now we're back to 100% Permian. And really, it's a testament to our people. We've always said that the best assets of Pioneer are our people, and they are our strongest asset. And that has been really what's made Pioneer a success. And it's really what's going to allow us for the next 25 years to continue to be part of the community, to work alongside the community, and make sure it's for that next generation that we leave it in better hands than we inherited it. So. With that, I'll stop there and we'll answer a few questions. But I really appreciate everybody being here. Yes.
Rich, thank you. Have a seat. Relax if you can with 700 of your favorite friends. We really appreciate your comments. I must admit that I got questions from a number of people out here that are in the oil and gas business, but your comments were very comprehensive. So I may repeat to some level, but there are many of us that need it repeated too. So let's just start with one. And one that's more of an overriding question, but what's the industry's biggest challenge from your perspective? Is it workforce development, which you touched on, equipment, inflation, infrastructure, acreage inventory, or something else?
I could make the case it's something else. It's the outside political influence.
Yeah.
Could be one. But I think as you just think about execution, I would say that, workforce is clearly going to be a big one. You can solve other things with money, but you got to have people to execute this business, and we're all getting smarter with technology and doing those things. But I do think that the workforce development is going to be an extremely important one. And then I think longer term, as I mentioned, supply is short in the world. The Permian has an abundance, but we're only getting, as many of you know, different things, but call it 6 to 10% of the resource out of the ground. There's a tremendous resource that we're still sitting on out here in West Texas that we've got to figure out what's that next technology. We used to do it with vertical drilling, then we went to horizontal drilling. What's next? Is it enhanced oil recovery? Is CO2 capture? What is going to be that next thing that allows us to unlock some other percentage of that oil and natural gas that's in the resource out here that we're not able to get today? And with human ingenuity, I'm confident we'll figure it out, and this industry will be around for a long time.
So, Rich, you're reminding me of a politician right now, even though you're a CPA, but you gave me 3 of the biggest problems there. So what's the biggest challenge? I'm going to repeat the same question. What's the biggest one of all that? Or is there one big one? Is it just multiples like you said?
I really think it's multiples. I don't think you can just pick one and say, if I solve that, it solves all of it, because, and maybe I am sounding like a politician, so apologies if it's taken that way, but because it's such a dynamic situation, all those things have to work together to be successful. And from running cities, running companies, it takes everybody pulling their weight to make it happen.
Rich, another question then. There's starting to be a lot of press that the Tier 1 acreage is starting to be drilled up. Do you agree with that? If so, how will that impact the industry out here?
I do agree with it. I think you've seen, the speed at which the Permian Basin grew was, doing that Tier 1 acreage. It's not to say, we've still got, a long number of years of drilling Tier 1 acreage, but I do think over time, it will get drilled up, and that'll move to Tier 2. That doesn't mean that, Permian's going away or not going to be here. It's going to be here for a long time, because Tier 2 looks really, really good too. And it also means that if you're in a higher commodity price, it's what's Tier 1 versus Tier 2. If you're what was maybe Tier 1 at $80 and tier 2 at $100 now looks just like tier 1 from a return standpoint. So I think there's a tremendous amount of running room left in the Permian Basin, and yes, as the thicker rock, better rock, more productive rock being drilled first, yes, because that's really the challenge that all of our investors want us to do, is to go after the highest rate of return stuff first. But that doesn't mean that we're not going to achieve that 7 million barrels or plus of production coming out of the basin over the next decade.
That's interesting. Thank you. You touched on takeaway capacity a good bit in your discussion with us. But the takeaway capacity for oil in the Permian seems to be in pretty good shape, but do you have any concerns with the pipelines being available for the increased production?
I think it's something we've got to pay close attention to. I think on the gas side equation, less or so on oil. I think we're good. NGLs, there's pipelines being proposed, so NGLs will need additional capacity over time. But gas is probably the biggest one out there that we need. That's really, they will get built. It's just, are they built quick enough? I mean, it's kind of like all these things. You want it to be ahead of time, and for pipelines to build those and midstream companies to build those, they want to know that they're going to be full, and they got to, they're going to put the capital in. They want to get a return on that capital, and so it's a balance of people, committing to get those pipelines built, and what's the speed at which they get built, and does that match the growth trajectory of gas? So, I think they're going to get built. It's just, selfishly, I wish they'd get built sooner so that capacity would be there, because I think it just helps where, we don't have upsets where you have negative bases, where you get better value for the gas in the Permian Basin. You have less venting and flaring from pressure situations when you don't have takeaway capacity. So to me, there's lots of benefits for having that extra capacity, and then it's just working with those pipelines. And so, I know a number of companies here, I'm sure, are talking to the various companies out there. They will get commitments. It's just, we need to be thinking today about what we need in 2025, 2026, and get those, pipes on the ground and being developed. Part of that comes with, knowing where that gas is going to go. And as I talked about it, LNG facilities and the government coming together and getting those, new LNG facilities permitted and approved so that construction can get done. As we all know, with supply chain, it affects LNG too. There's only a couple major, contractors that build LNG facilities. Their, calendar is getting booked up, and so those things need to get built so we're in a position that we have an outlet for that gas when it gets to the Gulf Coast, and so it can move globally around the world. And so to me, it's kind of like, what's the biggest challenge? Because it's a global market, I mean, it's not just what happens here in the Permian, it's the pipeline to get to the Gulf Coast and what's happening on the Gulf Coast. Ultimately, I think if we can get that gas to the Gulf Coast, it's going to, lift gas prices in the U.S. in the sense that, globally, if gas prices, which a longer-term forecast have them in that, call it, $12 to $18 an MCF range. When you think about the liquefaction and the transport to move that LNG to Asia or Europe, it's basically $5 or $6 an MCF. And so you can basically back into what that price would be in the U.S. If you're in that, call it 12 and take off 6, then that's a $6, gas price in the U.S. And I could easily see that happening over time as these facilities get built. And I think that, you'll see U.S. gas prices, just like oil, become a world market, not just a domestic U.S. Today it's just a domestic U.S. because we don't have enough capacity to move any extra, gas out of the country other than what we're doing today.
There's a lot to unpack there. That really does help me anyway. I hope it helps everyone else too. Another topic is the energy transition, and it's really a hot topic right now within the investment world especially. And it's often seemingly at odds with the push from investors to maintain capital discipline and check on reserves, be sure about reserves, the dividends, and all those pieces. So and then you put in there hydrocarbons and low carbon issues. So how does Pioneer handle all that?
Carefully. Well, now you sound like me in terms of you. That's a lot of things impacting one question. So
it is.
I don't even know where to start. I would say that from an investor standpoint, I mean, first and foremost, I think the world, as I mentioned, energy security has become a lot more at the forefront of making sure that countries around the world have a good source of energy and a consistent and reliable source of energy. the U.S. provides it. I mean, we're low cost, we're reliable, we're low emission, and we have abundant resource in this country if we can get the facilities to move it out. So, one, I think we can play a big role in not only having cleaner emissions and cleaner products that we move to market, but that we can provide that to the world and make it more energy secure for our allies and people that are supportive of democracies around the world. When I think about shareholders, shareholders, when we talk to them, they're all want us to see us continue to get better and better from an emission standpoint and on that energy transition. And we're 100%, as I said earlier, for energy transition. I mean, we think we're going to need, when you look at that population growth and the demand that energy is going to have, you're going to see that, we need all the solar, we need the wind, we need more nuclear. We're going to need all those other sources of power along with oil and gas. Some would even say coal to, meet the energy demands of the future across the world. So, from an investor standpoint, they always want to know that we're doing the best we can, and we kind of highlight, things that we've done. The Permian Basin, used to be flaring, 2 BCF a day. I mean, we're down to, a couple hundred million a day now of flaring. So, the amount of effort companies in this room have done has been tremendous, and, the energy that's produced in the U.S. is the cleanest in the world. And investors are coming around and understanding that. But I still think it comes back, investors, at the heart of investors is they want to get a return. They're investing other people's money, retirees' money, they need a return. And so they're focused on that return, and so it's still going to be incumbent upon the industry to, have a return on capital employed that competes with other sectors in the S&P 500. And so it's just one of those things that we have to be cognizant of. So I don't think we're going back to the days where we're using 100% of our cash flow to grow production. I think it's going to be in that 40 to 50% longer term. We're going to return more capital to shareholders. I mean, we try and look at it as a balance. We're trying to, basically between dividends and share repurchase, return about 10%, give shareholders a 10% return on that, and then grow our production about 5%, and that gives it basically an all-in return in that mid-teens of 15%. If commodity prices are higher, then we can make that return higher. If they're a little lower, then a little lower. But at a 15% type rate of return, we compete with most industries in the S&P 500. And so we can compete for those investor dollars. And that's really from, as we all know, shareholders own the companies. And our mission is to, meet their desires and needs, at the same time being responsible to employees and stakeholders and communities that we work with. So it's a complex issue, but fundamentally, our focus is on returns and how do we deliver shareholders adequate returns to continue to have them invest in the industry. So sorry, long-winded, but
no, it is a complex issue, and I really appreciate you walking through that for us. Taking a different term, but we've all watched and experienced the ongoing strain of the Texas grid as ERCOT struggles with that issue and demand. What's Pioneer doing to assist with the infrastructure issues and make that a stronger position instead of a weaker position?
Yeah, what I'd say is, probably the biggest thing is just planning and being ahead of it and working with, ERCOT, Encore, and planning ahead to make sure that power is there when we need it. And I think that's really for the challenge for the entire room is working with those to do that. Other things that we're doing, I mean, we have 30,000 acre ranches that surface on that we're looking for third parties to come in and put renewable sources on those, mainly because we can use that power in operations or we can use it to put it on the grid. So we think those are benefits that longer term if Pioneer's not using it's here for the communities there. But ultimately it's planning ahead and really working with the state and recognizing that what that demand forecast looks like. And then what are we going to do to meet it? And like I said before in the comments, to me, we're definitely going to need to use some of that gas that we're generating out here, for electric generation, in order to meet that demand that I think is coming.
Well, I'll tell you, it's time to wrap up, but I've really learned a lot, and I really appreciate all of your comments. I know the group does as well. There's a lot of information there, but thank you, Rich. And let's wrap up with an easier softball question for you. But you lived in Midland 89, I think, to 98. But what changes have you seen in our city, both from a community and a business perspective? Now that you live in Dallas, how do you view Midland? What do you see in Midland, and what most surprises you? What most impresses you?
Well, I'm always impressed by the people of Midland. People, it's a people business, and it's a small world, and so I think back to the time I was out here in Midland, and it was fantastic. I mean, like I said, the best part of my wife and I's life was being here in Midland, and it was quite rewarding. So, that part is we'll always treasure and love coming out here. And we have, on behalf of our 1,000+ employees out here, it's just a great place to be. But in terms of what's changed, I mean, it's been dramatic. You guys have seen it. I mean, it's like I said, when I first started out here, it was, all we knew was vertical drilling, and, typically it was one zone. We weren't even completing multiple zones with vertical drilling. And then to see the energy transition and shale take off and horizontal technology and turn the Permian Basin to, basically, as I said, once, people viewed as the largest stripper oil field in the U.S. to, now the second largest oil field in the world, and significant growth going forward. It's just amazing what everybody out here has accomplished and the speed at which this is accomplished. To go from 1 million barrels a day to basically 5 million barrels a day in a 5-year time period is, meteorical growth. And so, to me, the amount of, it was really demonstrates capitalism at work to see the people, equipment, infrastructure that had to go in to make that, accomplish that. And really, what is it, and kind of to wrap up on that, what has it done for the U.S.? I mean, it made the U.S. energy independent. And thanks to the hard work of people in this room, that's really what has put the U.S. in a position that we were never in before. We were always relying on, Middle East oil and places coming from other places that weren't always, friendly to the U.S. And the Permian Basin is the backbone and the workhorse of energy in the U.S. and will be that for decades to come. And so, to me, really applaud everybody in this room for the work that's been done and the speed at which you've done it and how you've made our great country even better. So thank you.
Very, very good. Let me end by saying that about 6 years ago, we started this oil and gas event, and it's been very well received. But you might find it interesting that Pioneer's been our lead sponsor since the beginning. But it really doesn't matter if there's someone up here from Pioneer or from Diamondback or Endeavor or Chevron or whoever it might be, they've been the sponsor of it. We want to say thanks to Pioneer again, and certainly thanks to Rich Dealy today. A lot of good information for you, and I think if you want the deck, I think we could get it sent to you from the chamber. Just let me know. But there's the deck of information on the screens that Rich provided. I think that's all right. Is that all right?
It is all right.
Too late now to stop. Yeah.
Whatever you say, Bobby.
Yeah, that's good. We're sharing it. So on behalf of the Chamber and Rich Dealy and the Pioneer, thank you for coming, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.